Hello, hello. So, today we're going to continue our discussion of Iranian political history, and we're going to start off today in the 18th century, which means that we're skipping quite a bit ahead because I left off with the Abbasid Caliphate yesterday in 1258 when the Mongols conquered it. So, we are skipping forward several centuries of disunity and various Turkic groups invading in and like a bunch of nomadism and the Mongols and all sorts of stuff. But we are going to be focusing obviously on polities and political history here. So we'll start off with the next really large empire. And that is the Safavid Empire. Now, hopefully, you retained just a little bit from your AP World History course. And you sort of remember that the Safavid Empire is one of the gunpowder empires. And, excuse me, da da da. So the Safavids here, they were a Turkic group. They came out of Azerbaijan and they conquered southwards into Persia by the late 1500s. They initially, the Azeri tribesmen who conquered in had converted to a particular branch of Shiism. Persian populations were already broadly Shiite, but this particular Azeri group had converted to Twelver Shiism. So Twelver Shiism, like we talked about yesterday, emphasizes the idea of almost sort of a millenarian mindset, that there are 12 foretold imams who will kind of shepherd shepherd the community of the faithful towards correct behavior until the revelation occurs and the apocalypse begins. And thus far, according to Twelver tradition, there have been 11 of these imams, and we are waiting for the Mahdi. The Mahdi is the hidden 12th imam. So these Azeri tribesmen had converted to this particular form of Shiism, and they conquer southwards into Persia. And as they conquer territory into Persia, they practice forcible conversion. These Azeri tribesmen are not exactly religiously tolerant, and their leaders, first Shah Ismail and then later Shah Abbas II, well, for the first and the second, both saw themselves as sort of the leaders of the Ummah, but also sort of the guardians of this tradition of Twelver Islam. And they therefore developed a particular branch of clerics within their religious structure known as ayatollahs. So ayatollahs are religious clerics who are the leaders of this Twelver branch of Islam. So when you hear the term ayatollah, it's not an individual's name, it's a title. It's like, oh gosh, it's more than being, just like a priest or a cleric or something like that. It's more like a bishop, archbishop. If you're thinking about sort of Christian connections there, that might be about the same sort of theological level. Okay. So the Safavid Empire was a militaristic empire because it had to be. It was sandwiched in between the Ottoman Empire to its west, which was Sunni, and the Mughal Empire to its east, which was also Sunni, and it did not get along with either of those groups. They also were constantly fighting off invasions from the Turkmenistan region, where there were a bunch of different tribal groups, as well as along the Afghani border. So that meant that the Safavids had to develop a really impressive military, which they did. They actually modeled it on the Ottoman method, where they had a professional corps of soldiers, essentially like the Janissary, who were trained in musketry and the use of gunpowder and cannons, and they had a military that was set to rival Western Europe. They also, especially under Shah Abbas I, Shah Abbas the Great, were well known for their diplomatic efforts. They understood that the Ottoman Empire was constantly at war with the it's not Hungarian yet, the Austrian Empire, what with the Ottomans attacking Vienna constantly and everything, and that the Ottomans were also at war with the Spanish and the French, And therefore, it might behoove the Safavids to kind of make friends with their enemy's enemies. You know the old phrase, like, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So the Safavids were really good at diplomacy with the Europeans. In particular, they developed very strong diplomatic connections to the Russians, which makes sense because they're right across the Caspian Sea from Russia, and that was a good trade opportunity, but also with the French and with the English. Now, that English connection is going to be important in the future, so just kind of like hold that in the back of your head for a while. So the Safavid Empire was good at diplomacy, had a strong military, really adopted a very, very strict form of Twelver Shia Islam. And they were relatively successful until the early portion of the 18th century. However, at that point, there were a number of tribal revolts, particularly in the Afghani region as well as in the Turkmeni region. And as a result, ultimately, they lost control of the capital city of Isfahan to Turkic tribesmen who swept in and conquered the city. This left the territory of Persia essentially kind of ungoverned for about 50 years. By 1794, however, things had started to reorganize, and a Turkic tribal group known as the Qajars seized control, and the ruling family of the Qajars established a dynasty. And the Qajar dynasty will rule Persia with some degree of structure to it until 1925. Now, during the early portion of this rule, the Qajar dynasty was pretty much an absolute government with very, very little sort of legislative input. They declared Shiism to be the state religion, and in order to kind of keep the imams and the ayatollahs on their sides, even though the Qajars hadn't previously been part of Twelver Islam, they declared Twelver Shiism to be the state faith, and they kind of established sort of a power-sharing agreement with the clerics. They said, the Qajar dynasty will be in charge of worldly power, but the clerics, they're in charge of religious authority. And they did not try to claim any sort of hereditary links to the 12 imams. Like, none of their leaders claimed to be the Mahdi. And that was a political choice here. They knew that they needed the Ayatollah on their side in order to seize control of Persia, and so they kind of made a political gamble, and they kept the clerics in power, and it paid off for them. So the Qajars consolidate power with the assistance of the Ayatollah and the Twelver clerics, who are kind of left in control as a result of all of this. Now, by the middle of the 19th century, you should know that the world is in a full swing of an industrial revolution, right? Yeah? And what does that industrial revolution need? Well, it needs fuel. And it just so happens that beneath Persia is a heck of a lot of oil. So one thing that you should know is that Persia is never, and later Iran, when they'll adopt that name, Persia is never directly politically colonized or imperialized by any Western power. It's never a colony, okay? So, like, the British never colonize Persia. What they do is they treat it more as an economic colonization. So, the Safavid Empire had established very strong economic and diplomatic ties with the UK in particular. They did a lot of business with them. And when the Safavid Empire fell out of favor and it eventually collapsed, the British were concerned. And so when the Qajar dynasty formed and they established control in that area, they very quickly kind of threw their power behind the Qajar dynasty. Now, by the middle of the 19th century, it became very clear that the British were kind of the world's superpower. And the Qajar dynasty was still kind of new in town in comparison to, say, other powers in the region. Now, the British had an awful lot of military might. The Qajars did not. So they made a decision, the Qajars did, to try to keep on the British good side, which was really their only option. And that included allowing the British to establish a joint oil company known as the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company when they discovered crude. Now, the argument was, well, hey, you guys don't have the technology to drill down for this stuff, but we sure as heck do. Let us do you a favor. We'll drill down, we'll extract it, we'll refine it, we'll give you some of the profits. I mean, that's an awful lot of work. You don't want to do it. So the Qajars, who were cash-strapped, said, sure, go for it. And thus, the British Petroleum Company was born. That's BP, okay? This is where BP comes from, all right? So this was never a direct form of imperialism. Iran was never a British colony. But you had this massive oil corporation developing that had an incredible amount of power over the Qajar dynasty and over their political decisions. Now, let's see here, just to kind of give you a bit of an illustration here. This is an depiction of the extent of the Safavid Empire. You can see the areas that are in shaded lines here. Those are areas that the Safavid Empire eventually lost. This territory right here was lost to the Ottomans, which really cut off the Safavid Empire Safavid access to Mecca for the Hajj. They lost that territory to the Ottomans, and the Ottomans wouldn't let them through. That means they lost control of Baghdad, which was a terrible loss for them. This, by the way, is still the modern border of Iran and Iraq. This area right here was under control of Turkmen and Uzbek tribal people quite frequently. This area is the Afghani region that was so difficult for them to control. This is an example of Safavid art. Safavid art is incredibly detailed and very, very fine. It's well known for its fantastic detail. Their capital city of Isfahan is covered in blue tile work, and their mosques are incredibly beautiful. I desperately want to go. It's on my bucket list. And the fellow off to the left, that is Shah Ismail I. He was the founder of the Safavid Empire. Okay, and then these are some images of the Qajar dynasty here. This right here, that's the Anglo-Iranian Company Limited being renamed as the British Petroleum Company, that is BP. And here is the symbol for the arms of the Qajar dynasty, and this is one of their shahs, one of their leaders. Couldn't tell you which one, I'd have to look it up. Now, so the early portion of the Qajar dynasty was pretty autocratic. It was a direct, absolute monarchy up until the 20th century. So in 1905, in an attempt to try to stay relevant and not to lose full power, and partially out of an armed revolt, you have something known as the Constitutional Revolution. Now, there were insurrections around the country during that 4-year period, but it was never a full civil war. So in order to maintain control in light of the uprisings that the Qajar dynasty saw, the Qajar rulers decided to allow for some reforms. Essentially, you can think of this as kind of like Ataturk in Turkey, where you saw sort of an attempt to modernize and to create a state that had some degree of democratic representation. This was a nationalist movement, and at the end of the Constitutional Revolution, there was a drafted constitution and the establishment of Iran's, because they're calling it that now, Iran's first legislative body called the Mejlis. However, this constitution is a mess and a half. It has no really clear ideology. It is a terrible marriage of a bunch of different ideas that don't work together. The only clear goal in the constitution is to weaken the power of the monarchy and create a constitutional monarchy. But beyond that, there are so many different factions in the Constitutional Revolution that nobody can agree upon what they're trying to fight for. There were communists fighting in this thing. There were nationalists who wanted to have like a full republic. There were people fighting who only wanted to sort of limit the power of the monarchy. There were people who wanted to totally get rid of the influence of the clergy. And so there were constant clashes, and the biggest clashes were between the secularists, those who wanted to emphasize worldly power and sort of separate faith away from the state, with clashes with the Ayatollah. And the Ayatollah, remember, was kind of the source and the validation and the legitimacy of the Qajar dynasty. And without the Ayatollah, they were kind of lost. So this was really a marriage made in hell as in terms of the first constitution. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that as soon as I move into the next video.